The bell rang, signaling the end of another monotonous day at Ridgewood High. The hallways buzzed with the usual chatter, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking, and the occasional burst of laughter. But today, something felt different. A new energy lingered in the air, though no one could quite put their finger on it. Maybe it was the way the sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than usual. Or maybe it was the presence of her. She walked in quietly, her dark curls pulled back into a loose ponytail, her eyes scanning the room like she was sizing it up. Her name was Amara Johnson, the new girl. She wasn't loud or flashy, but there was something about her that made people look twice. Maybe it was the way she carried herself. Shoulders back, chin up, like she wasn't afraid of anything. Or maybe it was the faint scar above her eyebrow, a small but noticeable mark that hinted at a story no one knew yet. Whatever it was, the whispers started almost immediately. "Who's that?" Someone muttered. "New girl." Another replied, as if that explained everything, but it didn't. Not even close. Amara wasn't just new. She was different. And in a school like Ridgewood, different wasn't always a good thing. The cliques had already formed years ago. The jocks, the cheerleaders, the nerds, the artists, and they weren't exactly welcoming to outsiders, especially not someone like Amara, who didn't seem to fit into any of their neat little boxes. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, and that alone made her a target. It didn't take long for the bullying to start. At first, it was small things. Snide comments in the hallway, mocking laughs during class, a stolen notebook here and there. But then it escalated. One day, during lunch, a group of guys led by Tyler, the star quarterback, decided to make her their new project. They cornered her near the lockers, their voices dripping with fake concern. "Hey, new girl," Tyler sneered, his buddies snickering behind him. "You know, you'd fit in better if you just, I don't know, tried a little harder. Maybe smiled more. Or just stayed out of the way." Amara didn't flinch. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Thanks for the advice," she said calmly, her voice steady. "But I'm good." Tyler didn't like that. He was used to people backing down, to them shrinking under his glare. But Amara didn't shrink. She stood her ground, and that only made him angrier. "You think you're tough, huh?" He shot back, stepping closer. "We'll see how tough you are when you're eating lunch alone every day." The group laughed, high-fiving each other like they'd just won some kind of prize. But Amara didn't react. She just walked away, her head held high. And that's when things started to get interesting. You see, what Tyler and his crew didn't know, what no one knew, was that Amara wasn't just some random new girl. She had a secret, one that would change everything. Because while they were busy trying to break her down, they had no idea who they were really dealing with. Amara wasn't just tough. She was a fighter. And not just any fighter. She was an MMA prodigy with years of training under her belt. She'd spent her childhood in gyms, learning how to take down opponents twice her size. She knew how to throw a punch, how to dodge a kick, and most importantly, how to stay calm under pressure. But she didn't want to fight. Not here. Not like this. She'd come to Ridgewood for a fresh start, to leave her old life behind. But sometimes, the past has a way of catching up with you, and sometimes people push you too far. The tension was building, like a storm brewing on the horizon. You could feel it in the air, in the way Amara's jaw tightened every time Tyler and his crew walked by, in the way her fists clenched at her sides. But she held it together, for now. She had a plan, and she wasn't about to let a bunch of bullies ruin it. Then came the day everything changed. It was after school, and Amara was heading to her car when she heard it. The sound of laughter, loud and cruel. She turned to see Tyler and his friends surrounding a smaller kid, shoving him back and forth like a rag doll. The kid's backpack was on the ground, its contents spilled everywhere, and he looked like he was on the verge of tears. Amara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She told herself to keep walking, to stay out of it. But then she heard the kid's voice, shaky and scared, begging them to stop. And something inside her snapped. She dropped her bag and walked over, her steps slow and deliberate. Tyler noticed her first, his smirk widening as she approached. Well, look who decided to join the party," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You here to save the day, new girl?" Amara didn't say a word. She just looked at him, her eyes cold and steady. And then, for the first time since she'd arrived at Ridgewood, she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill down your spine, the kind that made you realize you'd made a very big mistake. Tyler hesitated, his confidence wavering for just a second. But it was too late. Amara was done playing nice. What happened next would change everything. But that's a story for another time. The air was thick with tension as Amara stood there, her eyes locked on Tyler. The smaller kid, a freshman named Marcus, was frozen in place, his wide eyes darting between Amara and the group of bullies. Tyler's friends exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado faltering under Amara's unflinching gaze. But Tyler, ever the ringleader, wasn't about to back down. He took a step forward, his chest puffed out like he was trying to prove something. "What's the matter, new girl?" he taunted, his voice louder now, as if volume could make up for the cracks in his confidence. "You gonna cry? Or are you just gonna stand there and do nothing?" Amara didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her body language said it all. Her stance was calm but ready, her weight evenly distributed, her hands loose at her sides. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she wasn't running from one either, and that's what made Tyler nervous. He was used to people either cowering or lashing out in anger. But Amara? She was a mystery, and mysteries were dangerous. Marcus finally found his voice, stammering out a weak, "Leave her alone, Tyler." But his words were drowned out by the sound of Tyler's laughter, sharp and mocking. "Oh, look at this," Tyler sneered, turning to his friends. "The little shrimp thinks he's got a hero. Too bad she's just as useless as you are." That was it. Amara's jaw tightened, and for a split second, it looked like she might actually do something. But then, she took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing as she exhaled. She bent down, picked up Marcus's scattered books, and handed them to him without a word. Her movements were deliberate, almost graceful, and it only made Tyler angrier. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" he spat, stepping closer. "Well, newsflash, new girl. You're nothing. Just another loser trying to act tough." Amara straightened up, her eyes meeting Tyler's. "I'm not acting," she said quietly, her voice steady. "But if you keep pushing me, you'll find out just how tough I really am." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Tyler opened his mouth to respond, but for once, he couldn't find the right comeback. Instead, he just glared at her, his fists clenched, at his sides. The standoff lasted a few more seconds before Amara turned and walked away, Marcus trailing behind her like a shadow. As they reached her car, Marcus finally spoke up. Thanks," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to do that." Amara shrugged, unlocking the car doors. "Yeah, I did," she said simply. "No one deserves to be treated like that." Marcus hesitated, then asked the question that had been on his mind since the moment Amara stepped in. "Why didn't you fight back? I mean, you could have taken them, right?" Amara paused, her hand resting on the car door. For a moment, it looked like she wasn't going to answer, but then she sighed, her expression softening. "Fighting isn't always the answer," she said. "Sometimes walking away is the hardest thing to do, but it's also the smartest." Marcus nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "But what if they keep messing with you? What if they don't stop?" Amara's lips curved into a faint smile. But there was no humor in it. "Let's just say I've got a plan," she replied. "And if they push me too far, they'll regret it." The drive home was quiet, the weight of the day settling over them like a heavy blanket. Marcus couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, about the way Amara had stood up to Tyler without even raising her voice. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite put into words. She wasn't like anyone else at Ridgewood. She was different, and not in a bad way. Meanwhile, Amara's mind was racing. She hadn't wanted to get involved, but seeing Marcus being bullied had brought back memories she'd tried to bury, memories of her own struggles, of the fights she'd been in, of the scars, both physical and emotional, that she carried with her every day. She'd come to Ridgewood to start over, to leave that part of her life behind. But now, it seemed like the past was determined to follow her. That night, as she lay in bed, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. Tyler wasn't going to let this go. He'd see her defiance as a challenge, and he'd come back harder, angrier. And when he did, she'd have to make a choice: fight or walk away, protect herself or risk everything she'd worked for. The next day at school, the tension was palpable. Tyler and his crew were louder than usual, their laughter sharp and forced as they tried to pretend nothing had happened. But Amara could feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting. She kept her head down, focusing on her classes and avoiding the hallways as much as possible. But she knew it was only a matter of time before they crossed paths again. And then, during third period, it happened. Amara was in the library, trying to finish an assignment, when Tyler walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But then he spoke, his voice low and menacing. "You think you're so tough," he said, his eyes narrowing. "But you're not. You're just a nobody trying to act like you're something special." Amara didn't look up. She kept her eyes on her notebook, her pen moving steadily across the page. But inside, her heart was pounding. She could feel the anger bubbling up, threatening to spill over. But she held it in, her grip tightening on the pen. Tyler took a step closer, his voice rising. "I'm talking to you, new girl. You think you can just ignore me. You think you're better than me." This time, Amara looked up. Her eyes were calm, but there was a fire burning behind them. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," she said evenly. "But I'm not afraid of you, Tyler. And that's what really bothers you, isn't it?" Tyler's face turned red, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment, it looked like he might actually hit her. But then, the librarian cleared her throat, giving him a pointed look, and he backed off, muttering something under his breath as he stormed out of the room. Amara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. But she knew this wasn't over. Tyler wasn't going to stop. And the next time, there might not be anyone around to intervene. As the days went on, the tension between Amara and Tyler continued to build. It was like a ticking time bomb, just waiting to go off. And when it did, there was no telling what would happen. But one thing was certain: Amara wasn't going down without a fight. The days at Ridgewood High began to feel like a slow-motion countdown. Every hallway, every classroom, every glance exchanged between Amara and Tyler seemed to carry the weight of something inevitable. The tension was no longer just between them. It had spread like a ripple, affecting everyone around them. Students who had once ignored Amara now whispered about her in hushed tones, their curiosity piqued by her quiet defiance. Even the teachers seemed to sense the brewing storm, though they chose to look the other way, hoping it would blow over on its own. But it wouldn't. Tyler, for all his bravado, was growing increasingly frustrated. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Amara. She didn't cower, she didn't lash out, and she didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. It was infuriating. And the more she stood her ground, the more determined he became to break her. One afternoon, after football practice, Tyler huddled with his closest friends in the locker room. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and cheap body spray, and the sound of cleats clacking against the tile floor echoed through the space. "I'm done playing games with her," Tyler said, his voice low but sharp. "She thinks she's untouchable, but she's not. We're gonna show her what happens when you mess with us." His friends nodded, their expressions a mix of excitement and nervousness. They were used to following Tyler's lead, but this felt different. Amara wasn't like the other kids they'd picked on. There was something about her that made them uneasy, though none of them could quite put it into words. Still, they trusted Tyler. He was their leader after all. Meanwhile, Amara was doing her best to stay under the radar. She kept to herself, focusing on her classes and avoiding the usual hotspots where Tyler and his crew hung out. But it was getting harder. Whispers followed her everywhere, and the constant stares were starting to wear on her. She knew it was only a matter of time before things escalated, and she needed to be ready. One person who seemed to genuinely care about her was Marcus. The freshman had started seeking her out during lunch, sitting with her in silence at first, then gradually opening up. He was shy and awkward, but there was a kindness in him that Amara appreciated. He reminded her of herself at that age. Vulnerable, unsure, and desperate for someone to see him. "Why do you let them get to you?" Marcus asked one day, his voice tentative. "I mean, you're so strong. You could totally take them down if you wanted to." Amara sighed, pushing her food around on her tray. "It's not about being strong," she said. "It's about choosing your battles. Fighting them might feel good in the moment, but it won't solve anything. It'll just make things worse." Marcus frowned, clearly not convinced. "But what if they don't stop? What if they keep pushing you?" Amara looked at him, her expression serious. "Then I'll handle it, but not the way they expect." Her words lingered in the air, heavy, with meaning. Marcus wanted to ask more, but something in her tone told him to let it go. Instead, he changed the subject, telling her about a video game he'd been playing. Amara listened, grateful for the distraction. But the distraction didn't last long. Later that day, as Amara was walking to her car, she noticed a group of guys loitering near the parking lot. It was Tyler and his friends, their postures stiff and their eyes fixed on her. She hesitated for a moment, then kept walking, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hey, new girl," Tyler called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "We need to talk." Amara stopped, turning to face him. "What do you want, Tyler?" He stepped closer, his friends fanning out behind him like a pack of wolves. "I want you to stop acting like you're better than us," he said, his voice rising. "You're not. You're just some nobody who thinks she's tough. But you're not. And it's time you learned your place." Amara's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, her eyes locked on his, waiting to see what he would do next. Tyler took another step forward, his face inches from hers. "You think you're so cool, don't you? Walking around like you own the place. But you don't. And if you don't start showing some respect, you're gonna regret it." For a moment, it looked like Amara might finally snap. Her fists clenched at her sides and her breathing quickened. But then she took a deep breath, her expression softening. "I'm not looking for trouble, Tyler," she said quietly. "But if you keep pushing me, you're gonna get it." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Tyler's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, it looked like he might actually hit her. But then he backed off, his lips curling into a sneer. "We'll see about that," he muttered, turning and walking away with his friends in tow. Amara watched them go, her heart still racing. She knew this wasn't over. Tyler wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. And when he did, she'd have to make a choice. Fight or walk away. protect herself, or risk everything. As she got into her car and drove home, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. The storm was brewing, and when it finally broke, there would be no turning back. But for now, all she could do was wait and prepare. Because one thing was certain, Tyler had no idea who he was really dealing with. And when he found out, it would be too late.